Brought to you by Moonbeam Multimedia.
This is 16:1, a podcast about education, teaching, and learning.
Hi.
Hey.
Hey.
How's your week been?
Woo!
Your grades are due, so you've been doing all of that mess, huh?
Into the first 9 weeks.
Yeah. You made it a quarter of the way through the year, though.
You know, you're right.
That's a momentous occasion.
Let's be positive. So we made it a quarter of the way.
Mm-hmm.
I have lived 8 lifetimes this 9 weeks. No, it's been good. It's going well. I'm not going to say too much. You don't want to jinx it.
You don't want to jinx the whole year?
You know, if you're a baseball fan, you don't talk about a no-no, which is like when somebody's throwing a perfect game, you don't talk about it because you don't want to ruin it. So I'm not going to talk about it because I'm not going to ruin it.
All right. That of which we will not speak.
Yes.
Would you like to go ahead and tell us what you learned this week?
Yeah, I'm back into reading.
Yeah.
As it turns out, I have time. I mean, that's relative, but I have time.
I've been trying to hack my reading. This is something that you might find interesting. I hadn't been reading as much as I wanted to, and I've been hacking reading by like just playing it and making myself get up and do chores in the morning. Yeah. And just playing my audiobook while I do that. It's like a reward system for doing an unpleasant task.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's some sort of behavioral psychology that explains this.
Yeah.
Habit stacking.
Well, and also you're making something that you don't normally enjoy more enjoyable by getting to reward yourself with a book.
It's like a reward.
Okay.
What have you been reading?
I'm about 50 years late to the game.
Oh.
For the reference,
it happens.
That matters. I'm not even 50, so I'm still
spoilers. 50-year spoilers.
I'm 30 plus years late to the game, is what I'll say. I just read In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. I've always loved true crime. My mom loves true crime, so I get it very honestly. But what I learned was, well, one, he wrote that with a friend from childhood who was just so casually Harper Lee.
Oh.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
And the other thing that I learned about it was that I thought it was a fictional piece of work.
Mm-hmm.
It's not. It was entirely based on a real crime, true crime.
Okay.
And I didn't know that. And just something else about the book In Cold Blood. It was an instant success, and it is the second best-selling true crime book in history. And it comes behind Vincent Bugliosi's Helter Skelter from 1974, which is about the Charles Manson murders.
Huh. Interesting.
I knew that Truman Capote worked with Harper Lee. I did not realize that they were childhood friends.
Yeah, I didn't know that either.
And I also thought it was a piece of fiction, which it was not.
Update. I
just love Harper Lee, so I also wanted to read it for the sake of seeing some more of her influence, reading some more of her influence. So
cool.
Yeah. It's one of those things that's always been on my list, you know?
Mm-hmm. Cool.
Anyways, what did you learn?
Oh, I also read a book.
You did?
Yeah. This one, it was a big book. It took me a drive to Southern Maryland and back to finish this one on 2 times speed.
Yeah.
So it was a lot, but I read a book called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, The Fight for a Human Future at the New Frontier of Power.
We have very different living lists.
Okay.
Our Libby list could not be further from each other. I know. There's never any doubt when one comes available who it's for.
Listen, I have particular interests, okay? Now, here's the thing. This came out several years ago. I think 2017 or 2018, something like that.
So a lot has already changed.
Yeah. Yes. It's been on my list to read for that entire time. And, you know, this little COVID thing happened. And then I just completely, my reading life went off the rails for a while. But anyway, you're right. It does feel like a lot of the examples are from just like a slightly different era. Yeah. Everything just, it's like, oh yeah, I kind of remember that. There's like a lot of discussion of the Cambridge Analytica scandal. I don't know if you remember that, but like the book is basically about these huge treasure troves of data that big companies like Google and Meta and Amazon swallow up about us. The author's kind of making the case that it's not only that people have this data, but that it's actually being used to influence and kind of dictate behavior to some extent. And the whole case that the book is making is that the less we know about how our behavior is being directed in these ways, the more democracy is going to struggle the more we're going to have issues with the sort of self-actualization and autonomy that is necessary for democracy to function well, which I think is very interesting. There's a big behaviorist influence on this. There was a lot of discussion of Skinner, B.F. Skinner, which, believe it or not, has a direct tie into what we're talking about today with some of the psychology influence. And we talked about B.F. Skinner a bit in our educational psychology episode, which was episode 47, if you're interested in more about ed psych. So anyway, it was a lot. It was like philosophy. It was a lot of economics. It was a lot of data science. It was another one of these broad-ranging romps on a pretty difficult topic. But I really enjoyed reading it. It certainly made me more aware of how every phone and smart home device that we have is just spying on us all the time. So it's a little scary in that respect, but it's good to understand these things and these systems and sort of our place in them, and it gave me a lot to think about, that's for sure. So that's what I learned about.
Interesting.
Are we ready for our education headlines?
We are ready.
This one is yet again from our home state here in Ohio. It's a bit of an update of a story we've had before.
Ever disappointing. Okay. Here we go. A Franklin County magistrate has ruled that Ohio's public education system restructuring can proceed while lawsuits brought by parents and former Ohio State Board of Education members work their way through the court system. The ruling was approved by a judge on Friday the 20th, and the temporary injunction preventing the restructuring was lifted. Critics of the reorganization still have a chance to prove their case in court, but Ohio teachers now seem to at least have a provisional answer to the question of who will be cutting the checks to Ohio schools.
Do you feel better about this?
No.
No.
This feels like they put a Band-Aid on a water tower that was leaking, but that's a good start.
Yeah, I read the ruling, and the magistrate was like, the state had made the case, the state meaning the people on DeWine's side, because it's the state suing the state, I think, in this case.
This is really special.
Employees of the state suing the state. I don't know. It's very complicated. But the DeWine side of things was making the case that if we don't let this restructuring proceed as intended, it's going to be mass chaos, which is exactly what we were talking about last episode.
Yeah.
But anyway, the magistrate was like, yeah, you're right. It will be completely chaotic. So maybe we should just go ahead with the plan. And in the meantime...
So they're basically spinning it.
I mean...
Basically, the game is, it's chaos either way.
Yeah, the governor was just kind of like, ask for forgiveness, not permission, about the restructuring of I guess it's called the Department of Education and Workforce now.
Oh, Mike. Why you gotta be like this, man?
So, there's still the question of the constitutionality of the budget bill, this House Bill 33.
That started it all.
Yes, which relates directly to our next headline.
Go ahead.
Because there's yet another lawsuit about House Bill 33 in Ohio.
More disappointment in Ohio. Mm-hmm. Okay, go.
This headline actually relates to yet another story that we've been covering for some time about phonics instruction. And we recommended the APM Reports podcast called Sold a Story about phonics instruction. Mm-hmm. The gist of this is that there's this professional association in Ohio. It's a Worthington-based association called the Reading Recovery Council of North America. Reading recovery is the buzzword that's relevant here because reading recovery is the program that makes use of this now widely discredited, I guess I would say, approach to phonics instruction. The main sort of facet of that being what's called the 3 cueing approach to literacy acquisition. And that's just the kind of way of using like context clues and other questions like that to help understand things rather than basically like phonics, like phonetic.
Okay.
Yeah. So anyway, back to House Bill 33. The Reading Recovery Council is suing the state over House Bill 33 because they are taking issue with the fact that the budget bill prohibits explicitly the 3 cueing approach that they apparently still enjoy.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, even though it has all this science kind of conflicting with the efficacy of it, and it's been shown that even like short-term gains that happen as a result of this approach later get turned over compared to peers who don't have this kind of instruction. All this evidence... But there's at least a vocal minority of educators who are still very committed to this method and think that it helps.
Right.
And that's the problem. So anyway, they're suing because the budget bill prohibits 3 cueing, and that's in direct conflict with the reading recovery program. So Yeah.
Oh, gosh.
It's fascinating. It may be the case that this budget bill does violate the Constitution, but I think that it wouldn't exactly be counted as a victory for students and parents if this particular lawsuit were to move forward. But anyway.
Okay. Last article.
Yes.
Xi Jinping and the ruling Chinese Communist Party are attempting to step up patriotic education in China's schools, universities, and religious institutions. A new draft of a patriotic education law is making its way through the National People's Congress Standing Committee and is expected to be approved. The legislation is reminiscent of patriotic education initiatives that emerged in the early 1990s in the aftermath of the student-led Tiananmen protests. Critics say that the law is less actual law than pillar of a cult of personality around Xi Jinping. Pro-democracy protesters, both within and outside of China, say that the new legislation will have a chilling effect on education funding for critical thinking and liberal studies initiatives.
Yeah.
Ooh, this could be interesting.
There are a lot of people saying that it's not so much a law as just like a bunch of sloganeering, just like random thoughts about education and philosophy kind of making its way into official policy.
Yeah.
Which
like
is
just some hot takes that are like gathering.
Yeah.
Got you.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people are seeing this as a response to increasing unrest because of economic instability in China. And like, this is not an area where I have a great deal of familiarity or expertise. Right. But it is interesting to consider how this trickles down throughout the country and just like, the various intricacies of the CCP and
because it feels like a propaganda. You know what I mean? Like
propaganda. Yeah. Some of the commentary that I was reading, and again, it was kind of hard to find sources on this story, but the ones that I was reading were just kind of saying that, like, this is increasingly something that Xi Jinping has been doing, turning his personal, like he's, they're like billboards of his face all over the place. And like, it's weird. It's weird.
Is this like the quote that's like, you can't trust anything you find on the internet, and it says it was spoken by Abraham Lincoln?
Yeah.
It's like,
it's definitely to that effect. So as I mentioned at the top of the show, we did do an episode that was a kind of broader overview of educational psychology. That's episode 47. Go check it out if you'd like to listen. This week, we're focusing in on just one figure, prominent figure among educational psychologists, developmental psychology. We're talking about Jean Piaget, which is a name that anyone who comes close to a school of education will probably have heard at some point.
Not because you wanted to.
Not because you wanted to.
Not because you saw Piaget in the library and like, this looks interesting.
I was putting together the notes for this and I was just like, oh man, I remember the classroom I was sitting in grad school when we were going over this stuff.
Big influence.
Still an outsized influence on many education programs.
Yes.
I heard people compare Piaget's work to ranking almost at the same level of Freud's, but among developmental psychologists.
Okay.
Which I thought was interesting. I didn't realize it was quite that. He was quite that influential. But yeah, curriculum design, formal education programs, big influence. So Piaget was born in Switzerland in 1896. He died in Geneva in 1980. Good long life.
That was a good life. I'm thinking of the time. That's a pretty hardy life.
Yeah, it's a lot of time to make a big influence. He wrote more than 60 books and published a couple hundred articles on theories of cognitive development, education, psychology, philosophy, epistemology. He's very interested in epistemology, which is the branch of philosophy concerned with knowledge. So like the nature, origin, scope of knowledge, and the rationality of belief and these things. This was a fun story. At age 11,
I loved this part.
Yeah, he was a pupil at a Latin high school, and he wrote a short article on an albino sparrow, which I thought was interesting. A little 11-year-old just out there being a regular. I don't know. Was he following in the footsteps of Darwin?
Probably.
A little 11-year-old observer of nature.
Of albino sparrows.
He also studied mollusks, which
he wrote about mollusks pretty in depth.
When I was reading his special interest for a while.
Yes. I was like, did I really have to listen to so much Piaget and nobody told me that his start was in mollusks?
Got his start in mollusks.
Why didn't anybody tell me that? I would have been like 10% more interested.
Okay.
Because I would have wanted to know why mollusks and now why children's brains.
Yeah, I want to know why that would have made you
That's
more
what I
interesting.
mean. Like,
okay.
Yeah, okay.
While he's pursuing his PhD, he begins to be interested in psychoanalysis. It's the hot topic at the time.
Yep.
In his personal life, he and his wife have 3 children around the time when he, starts to establish his career and whatnot. He and his wife have 3 children, and this is relevant because he uses his kids to study.
You do.
No, you don't. You don't, though.
You gotta use them.
He studies his own children and their intellectual development from infancy to language acquisition.
Okay.
Creepy. It's just creepy. I don't know. It's creepy.
No, I think it's fine.
It creeps me out.
You didn't know it until later. And then you'd had a lot of therapy about it.
Yeah, for real. This is going to come up later, but there are modern reviewers who point out that there are a lot of studies of Piaget's that would probably be rejected from most modern journals because of methodological grounds, obviously.
Yeah. That part, though, he was living at exactly the time that he could for what he was doing. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Like, only in the window of his life did what he did work.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that.
Yeah.
He took the most advantage of the time as he could.
Medical ethics.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
But anyway, he moves from Switzerland to Paris after he graduates. He teaches at this school for boys. School is run by Alfred Binet, developer of the Binet-Simon test, which later becomes the Stanford-Binet intelligence scales. It's the IQ test that everybody thinks of when they think of IQ tests. So Piaget assisted with the grading of these IQ tests. And while he's doing this, he starts to observe patterns that he comes to believe make up boundaries around stages of development. So children of certain ages would consistently miss questions, for example, that older peers or adults would answer correctly, things like that. In 1929, he joins the faculty of the University of Geneva as a professor of child psychology, and he stays there until his death.
He committed.
He sure did.
So Piaget believed that learning occurs through assimilation, which is adjusting new experiences to fit prior concepts.
You will be assimilated?
You will be. You don't have an option with Piaget.
I am locutus of Piaget.
And also through accommodation, which is adjusting concepts to fit a new experience. So the back and forth between assimilation and accommodation leads to both short-term learning and long-term developmental change. And these long-term developments are what become the main focus of Piaget's cognitive theory. Piaget was a proponent of what he called, which I love, that he was working at a time where he just decided what it was.
He makes it up.
Genetic epistemology, which is a theory suggesting that all knowledge that a child has is generated through interactions with their environment. Piaget proposed that knowledge and cognition co-develop through distinct stages from birth to the end of adolescence.
This staging thing is basically...
This is his thing.
This is the gist of his thing.
Yeah, this is what you probably know
Stages
him for.
of development.
So, just a few notes on his stages before we start breaking them down further. The stages always happen in the same order, and no stage is ever skipped.
This is according to Piaget.
Yes, this is...
Other people do kind of want it to be a little squishy later.
Sure.
For him, at least.
Each stage is a significant transformation of the stage before it, and each later stage incorporated the earlier stages into itself.
Got it.
Those are kind of like his rules, I guess I would say. So he has a staircase model of development, and there are 4 major stages of cognitive development.
Staircase model.
Yes.
Why is it called a staircase model?
Because you keep building as you go.
Oh.
Right?
Okay. But they're like plateaus. Is that what the steps are?
I guess I was thinking staircase because it's wider at the bottom, and that's like your foundational knowledge, and then you keep building on top of it.
Like a pyramid?
Kind of, but just on the one side, since that's how stairs work.
I'm trying to figure out what you mean by being wider
everything at the
bottom
remains, but as you learn more and more...
Yeah, but it's not... Unless you have like a grand Beauty and the Beast staircase.
Am I not imagining this in every textbook I read in college? Hold on.
I really want to know.
This is the one I was thinking of. Like, this is how I remember seeing it in college.
So it is like a pyramid, kind of. But one side of a pyramid. I see what you're doing here.
One side of a pyramid.
Yeah, it's like a cross-section of a pyramid. You know what?
We're doing one half of a cross-section of a pyramid.
Spatial geometry is not our strong suit.
Okay. I would like to say it is not your strong suit.
I skipped the stair step.
You were the only person who missed that step, and it was the first one.
Well, we should include that graphic in the show notes. But the idea is that one stage stacks on top of the next, and that's what defines progress through these stages of development.
His development model has 4 major stages. The first one is called the sensory motor intelligence, and it is from birth to age 2. This period is defined as when infants think by means of their senses and their motor actions.
Okay.
These actions, so thinking by way of touching, manipulating, looking, listening, biting, chewing, they allow children to learn about the world and are crucial to their early cognitive development. So these actions allow the child to construct simple concepts of objects and events, which leads into object permanence as being one of the major achievements of this stage, because it shows that they now understand that even though something is not actually in front of them, it can still exist in the world.
Yeah.
It's why peekaboo is so funny to babies. Because you cover your face and they're like, oh, wow, that's cool. They're gone.
So it's basically like prior to developing object permanence, you forget that things exist when you can't see them.
Yeah. And so that's one of the biggest markers of the stage, because that usually happens closer to the 24-month mark than it is to like younger infants around 6 months. So that's one of the last big things that a child accomplishes before moving into stage 2.
Okay.
So stage 2 is pre-operational thinking, and that's from ages 2 to 7.
Pre-operational thinking. Okay.
According to Piaget, one of the most obvious examples of this kind of cognition is dramatic play or make-believe. So children engaged in imaginative activities are thinking on 2 levels at once, right? Because they're imagining whatever they're doing, but there is also the reality of what's in the room, what they have to play with,
Imagination.
Right. So this dual processing of experience makes dramatic play an early example of metacognition, or reflecting on and monitoring of thinking itself.
Thinking about thinking. That's what metacognition means. Okay.
And so because metacognition is a highly desirable skill for success in school, teachers of young children, like preschool, kindergarten, even 1st or 2nd grade, often make time and space in their classrooms for this kind of play, and sometimes will even participate in it themselves to help develop that play further. So that was up to around age 7.
Okay, so then we get to the next stage, which is around the ages 7 to 11, and this is called concrete operational thinking. And this is when kids start to be able to represent ideas and events more flexibly and start to use logic to reason through things. They're not yet able, though, to operate or think systematically about representations of objects or events. So manipulating representations is more an abstract skill that develops later. The other new thing that happens during this stage is that the child starts to be able to decenter and focus on more than one feature of a problem at a time.
Okay, so you did stop at about age 7. Good. That's why you don't understand the stairs. Because they didn't go up any further.
My stair is just one. A stair of one. One stair.
You have a hump.
Okay. Okay, and then we get to the final stage of childhood development here. Formal operational thinking, ages 11 and beyond. This is when children become able to reason. They can reason not only about like tangible stuff around them, objects and events, but also about hypotheticals or abstract thoughts, like imagine if you will. This is the period when children can start to operate on forms or representations. And that basically means that a teacher can pose hypotheticals or contrary to fact problems, manipulating ideas in a couple of different ways at once, all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I'm thinking like as an English teacher, of course. All of those are great questions to be asking because they'd have to have support for what they're saying. So
yeah. And you can see where these kind of build one on the next. I remember very specifically when I was learning about this in grad school that I was bothered by the idea that it was rigid and that it had to be in order and that you had to go from one to the next. I was like, I don't feel like I've known any person who could just be like, oh yes, they've moved from stage 3 to stage 4 or stage 1 to stage 2. And I just felt like the boundaries were much less rigid. And I think maybe Piaget, he even said that a lot of his work ended up being kind of misunderstood later in life.
It's kind of one of those things that when you kind of get noticed for the thing that defines you, right, then you're always answering to that thing, which kind of seemed to be the case for him.
Yeah.
Like once these operational stages existed in the way that he had presented them as these in the staircase method, right? That was it. That's
kind of interesting because it touches on a couple of criticisms of his work. So the first one is that the structure is overly rigid.
I think so too.
I think at least this was true of the way that it was taught when I was in grad school. It's like, here's some information. These are useful ways of thinking about stages of development. They're kind of useful approximations rather than rigid stages or whatever.
Yeah.
And then the other thing was like kind of what you were just talking about. Another criticism of his work is that there was too much emphasis placed on what children couldn't do. And that's what defined the stages rather than what they could do. So his focus on the not being able to reach certain markers of a stage tended to obscure the ways in which certain children could maybe reach way beyond an appointed stage or across, domain specific areas or something like this. Yeah, just like focusing on the absence of indicators did tend to obscure other indicators that could have popped up. And this is another like methodological issue that some people take with a lot of his research. So, and this is hard because it's, research with kids who are
your children.
Famously mercurial and kind of difficult to pin down, but some researchers have said that they thought that his questions of children were sometimes too complex to be accessible, basically. And they're like, well, if you would have asked the same thing in a slightly different way, or you would have simplified the task you were asking them to do or something, they might have been able to do it.
Sure.
And it's more just about how you're conducting the test. You think you're measuring whether or not a child has moved to a stage, but what you're actually measuring is how well you wrote a test question. I mean, I think educators, you as an educator know what this is like.
I feel that deeply.
You feel it viscerally when you see that the test the students are taking is failing them instead of the other way around because there's something just wrong with the wording or whatever. Another criticism here, there's too much emphasis on genetic or hereditary factors of human development and not enough on social and cultural influences on cognitive growth.
I was going to mention with that, there's no difference with him based on the sex of the child, right? Because boys, as we know now, develop through these ages, not as quickly as girls do. And just other factors like you were talking about, like cognitive ability, what's your home life like? There are so many other factors to these things aren't being addressed. And I think at the whole, I guess when I was taught Piaget, I kind of always thought it as these are the indicators we should be looking for to kind of help us better understand to stage students.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of where it was for me. And maybe that's just how I was taught him as well, because my professors had a better understanding of kind of the heart of it. But there's so many other factors to this. Like when I talk to my friends who have kids, they'll talk about like what one of their kids does that the other one didn't do at this age. And they're like, oh, that's totally normal. Like, and so it's just those things like that just happens with kids.
I will say we have friends who have a daughter who just turned 7. And you and I were even talking about this. We feel like we've seen a shift with her. And it's right around this age between stages 2 and 3. When you go from 6 to 7, it's like the concrete operational thinking starts to kick in. And you and I were talking about how, because we hadn't seen her for a while.
Yeah, that
and then
was
we came back and we visited with these friends and we saw her and it was just like, whoa,
she was like
this?
A little human.
Yes, it was like a little adult is what it felt like. All of a sudden, kind of. And I'm just like, what happened? The last time I saw you, you were just kind of like screaming about things.
We didn't see her for like a year. She did kindergarten. Like there were all of these huge things that had happened.
Yeah.
But when we saw her again, I was like, she feels like a totally different person. Like she was just a grown up all of a sudden. So I think that different ages of kids hit like that too. Like we always talk at school, even the jump to 9th grade is a huge deal. Like there's a lot of change there. So, and that's even later than what he would have listed as, a stage.
I will say, I don't know if this is true of your experience with teacher education. I think that Piaget's theories tend to be brought up when it comes to looking out for learners who might be veering off the track of kind of the expected markers of development.
Yeah.
I think maybe unfortunately, I don't know. It tends to be the most useful legacy of the theory is course correcting when things go off track.
I think,
which I'm not really sure Piaget would have liked, but
I don't think so. But I also think that when we finally get around to doing an episode with a school psychologist, I'll be very interested to hear about like these markers and indicators that they're looking for, because one of our good friends is a school psychologist and she works in an elementary school. So she talks a lot about kindergarten screening and things like that and kind of identifying at those stages, is a student ready? Should they wait another year? Have they completed the year of kindergarten? Should they repeat it?
It can be really hard to test for anything at those ages because Attention spans are very short.
There's
tempers
a butterfly in the corner.
Yeah,
there's a stranger at the door.
Or they can be overwhelmed.
Their socks are too tight.
They didn't get a nap.
Yeah.
Like, it could be anything.
I just realized I was describing you.
Oh, yeah.
There's a stranger. No.
True.
But truly, there are so many things that can impact those sometimes brief interactions that could somehow be like, oh, they're only at this stage, whatever the case. So I think what he wanted to help educators understand is that there are certain things that should be and could be happening by ages, and that we should try to help guide students into that learning when it's appropriate. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Age appropriateness is definitely something that emerges from this.
And I think that's good. Last thoughts on Piaget?
It was interesting to dust off the old college textbook.
Didn't know about the mollusks. I'd love to know more about that.
I want to know about the, what was it? The albino...
Sparrow.
The albino sparrow. I'm going to go find that paper. If you wouldn't mind, talk to an educator friend of yours, or a student friend of yours, or anyone who is interested in teaching, learning. Give us a shout out, if you will. We grow by word of mouth, and we really appreciate you all who take the time to tune in every other week. But if you wouldn't mind, just, spread the word. Also, if you do want to sign up for our newsletter, you can do so by visiting our website, 16to1.com, all spelled out, and just scroll down to the bottom of the page, any page.
And
yes,
we are prepping.
We are.
For our 100th episode.
We sure are.
And we would love for you to send us in questions that you've always wanted to ask teachers.
Yes.
And you haven't yet. This is your chance.
We're going to force Katie to answer your questions.
I will do it.
On air.
And I can answer them anonymously. I won't.
Yes, you don't have to attach your name to it.
So send us some questions. I know you have them.
Your most burning questions
that won't
for the
jeopardize my career.
Yes.
Okay.
I
was thinking about some of my friends. I was like, nope, you don't get free reign.
Okay, fair.
All right.
Fill in the blank. Here was last episode's question. According to a 2021 Pew Research study, what percentage of parents with children whose schools were closed during the pandemic said that their child encountered at least one technology-related obstacle to completing their schoolwork during that time? That was 34% of parents. So more than a third of parents observed at least one snafu having to do with technology and at-home work.
Yep. This episode's question.
Yep. Go for it.
One of the institutions at which Piaget studied is a world-renowned public research university. It is claimed that at the time Piaget was admitted, he was the only Swiss to be invited to study there from 1952 to 1963. Marie Curie was the first woman to become a professor at this famous university. So what was that university?
Final thoughts, parting shots, anything from you?
I think if we've learned anything this episode, it's that if you're becoming a psychoanalyst, don't use your own children.
Yeah, that's the big takeaway for me, for sure. Don't experiment on your own progeny.
All right, we'll see you next episode.
Bye.
Bye.
Hey listeners, thanks for supporting 16 to 1. We're your co-hosts. I'm Chelsea Adams.
And I'm Katie Day. Find our show notes, archives, and resources, sign up for our newsletter, or get in touch with us via the contact form at 16to1.com, all spelled out.
We are so grateful for our listener support. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing to the show and telling your friends or colleagues about it.
The show is edited and produced by you, Chelsea Adams, and you're also responsible for our show's music.
And you, Katie Day, serve as lead researcher and social media manager.
Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you next show. Okay. So
I interrupted. Please go ahead and take us back to the first stage.
Back to Piaget's staircase model.
Yes.
Or a section of a pyramid, for those of you unsure of what stairs look like.
Cross section
in my head, I was like,
a pyramid.
Does she not know what stairs look like? You were like a pyramid, and I was like, just the half.